Woodcutters, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. Today we are making a roasted tomatillo salsa that we are going to can. And if you are not familiar with tomatillos, a lot of people aren't. They are similar to a tomato. They're related. They're in the nightshade family. They come in this little papery husk, and they are really delicious, and you can make a green salsa out of them. And that's typically how they're used in Latin cooking, is a salsa verde or a green salsa. You need 2 tomatillo plants in order to pollinate each other, in order to get fruit, which is something that I didn't know for many years. And I think I learned that from Jess on Roots and Refuge. And when she said it, I looked it up because I was like, nah, they're nightshades, they're self-fertile, that's not true. And then I Googled it, and sure enough, it is true. Which explains why when I was living in Colorado, I could never get any ripe tomatillos. I always got beautiful plants and no fruit because I was only planting 1 plant. You need 2. I have several varieties that I'm growing this year. They seem to be producing about the same. They come in green. You can also sometimes find varieties that have a bit of a purple tinge, and you'll see in this video that the variety that I'm mostly using is a purple variety. Not going to be the most glorious looking salsa when it's canned because of that purple tint. And interestingly, the seed from this purple tomatillo, most of the years that I've grown it out, they have not been purple, they've been green. But for some reason, this year I have 2 of them from this variety, and one of them is showing purple rather than green. I don't know what that's about. I would prefer green if I could find it, but I'd grown this whole packet of seed out over the course of several years and never had them show up purple, and then this year I have one that's purple. Who knows what that's about. But tomatillos, you pick them when they're starting to break out of their little husk, and so you can see how this husk is no longer closed. It's basically plumped up enough that it is pushing its way out of its husk. That is when they're ready to pick. You can leave them and pick them when they're green like this, or you can leave them and they will get a little bit more ripe and more yellow, and they're going to be a little bit sweeter when they're yellow like this. They will sometimes just fall off, and if they're not bug eaten or having any issues, you can just pick them up off the ground and use them as well. I tend to like them a little more tart. I don't love them super sweet, and so I tend to pick them when they're more on the green side rather than on the more yellow side. And then this recipe is a roasted tomatillo salsa. There are a variety of canned tomatillos salsa recipes out there. This one I like because it roasts, and it roasts not just the tomatillos, but everything. So the chilies, the onion, the garlic, and that's just going to give it a little bit more rounded flavor. I tend to like to use this in green chili enchiladas, and it's going to be a better flavored enchilada mix if it's been roasted. And I'll put a link to where I found this recipe. For years, when I was first growing tomatillos, I had a really hard time finding recipes for a canned tomatillo salsa. And there was a lot of debate about the acidity of tomatillos and whether they were safe to can without doing a bunch of other stuff. And then somewhere along the way, I was talking to a food scientist from Oregon State University's food program, and he just off the cuff happened to mention that tomatillos are generally more acidic than tomatoes. And so basically there's no issue with canning them in terms of making salsa. Follow a tested recipe, add the vinegar, but they are not less acidic than tomatoes. They're actually more acidic than tomatoes, and so they're a little bit more forgiving. This recipe, the chilies that are in it, it calls for jalapenos. You can change out chilies in a recipe as long as you keep the volume approximately the same. And so if you don't like jalapenos because you think they're too hot, you could use green peppers or red peppers or, banana peppers or whatever you had on hand that was more mild. You could decide that jalapenos weren't going to be hot enough, and so you could use serranos, you could use cayennes, you could use whatever you had that you thought was more hot that you wanted. But look at the volume of a typical jalapeno and then compensate for that. So it might take, 3 or 4 serranos to equal 1 jalapeno, etc. So, but that's a really great tip for canning this time of year, is you can change out the variety of pepper in a recipe. It doesn't have to be the one that's called for, as long as you keep the volume approximately the same. So roasted tomatillo salsa, it's going to be delicious, and we're going to be eating it all winter on wonderful enchiladas. Let's get started.
So I'm weighing out 2 kilograms worth of tomatillos here, which is about 4.4 pounds. And then I'm going to give everybody a good bath and take off those papery husks. Tomatillos can be kind of sticky, and so it's always a good idea to give them a rinse. And sometimes that paper husk can be a little bit stuck to the fruit because of that. And I've got a few that are bug-eaten or damaged that I have some others in the basket that I'm just trading off as I find them here. Sometimes you miss that when you're picking them. See, that one's a little bit stuck. And most of these are the purple ones. I sell tomatillos as well, and the purple ones are a little bit of a harder sell. And so I decided I would just make my salsa out of the purple ones because I don't care if it's got a little bit of a purple tinge to it. I think it's kind of pretty. And then I'm going to roast these in a 425 degree oven. And I'm flipping everything over so that they are stem side down. Not super critical, but it was what the recipe called for, so I went ahead and did it. I did spray this with just a little bit of cooking spray. And then I'm adding in some jalapenos that I've split in half. And then 2 small onions that I've quartered up. And the recipe only called for 2 jalapenos. I actually have 4 here, and that's just because they weren't very big, and so I increased the volume. And then 6 cloves of garlic. And I'm kind of tucking that garlic down into the tomatillos just so that it doesn't burn. We're going to roast this for 15 minutes. Those purple tomatillos are so pretty. And then after 15 minutes, I'm going to take off the garlic. The garlic should be fairly soft at this point. And if you leave it in for too long, it's going to burn. And so I'm checking to make sure it's fairly tender and then fishing out the garlic. And then back in the oven for another 15 minutes. And at this point, you should start to see some of those tomatillos have a little bit of charring on them, some of them starting to collapse in on themselves just a little bit. And that's going to give you some really nice flavor. And then everything goes into my food processor. I really overfilled this. Thankfully, it didn't leak, but I really put too much in here. And I did pick off the skins that were on those onions before I threw them in the food processor. And then you're just going to pulse that until it's basically a puree. So no big chunks. And then into our pot it goes. And then I need a half a cup of fresh lime juice. You will see things telling you that you shouldn't use fresh citrus in recipes. You should always use bottled. This recipe actually did call for fresh, and there's been some interesting studies that I've seen on that showing that the bottled stuff is standardized and the fresh stuff tends to be actually more acidic than the bottled stuff because it saves them money if they can add a little bit of water to the bottled stuff. And so you're fine using fresh citrus juice if it's called for in a recipe rather than bottled. This is cilantro. It's the leftover cilantro from my chimichurri recipe, which was convenient because I didn't have to go pick any. And I needed about, I think it was a 1/4 cup. And I always, whenever recipes call for stuff like that, they never indicate like how packed in it should be. And so I always assume like really packed in. And so this is just like leveled off, not packed down. And then I had enough left. I thought, I could probably get all of that into that cup if I really pushed it down. And so I just decided to put it all in there. A couple teaspoons of canning and pickling salt. You don't want any iodine. And then a teaspoon of black pepper. I have no heat on at this point. I'm just stirring everything in. And I had cooked those tomatillos the day before, and so they had been refrigerated overnight. So everything's nice and cold right now. Giving it a taste just to make sure, does it have enough heat? Does it have enough salt? You could probably put in a little bit of cumin into this if you wanted to as well. I chose not to. And then I probably should have started this sooner, but I'm getting my canner ready. A little bit of vinegar in the water. If you've got hard water, will keep hard water deposits from forming on the outside of your jars. And I just put that jar in there to give me an idea of level so that I would put enough water in there once it was displaced by the full jars. bring your tomatillo solution up to a full boil, and then ladle it into your jars, and you want to leave a ½ inch of headspace. And I have this handy dandy little plastic wand that helps me measure headspace, but you can also just go by this diagram that's in the front of one of the ball books if you don't have one of these little doohickeys. This is a fairly recent purchase for me. I do really like it because I'm one of those people that loves precision, and so I like the fact that I can measure things precisely with that. And then I also have a bunch of different kinds of jars. I've bought canning jars at estate sales for many, many years. And so some of my jars are really old, some of them are more recent, and they do vary a little bit in terms of how full looks like full. And so it's nice to have one of those measuring wands so that I can tell. This recipe says that it makes 3 pints. I got 4 pints out of this. I almost always get more volume than what the recipe calls for. I don't know what that is, why they're so inaccurate. It's really frustrating, but word to the wise, always have extra canning jars standing by. Don't assume it's going to make exactly what it calls for. It could be because the recipe said 2 kilograms or 4 pounds. 4 pounds is not 2 kilograms. 4.4 pounds is 2 kilograms. And so I actually have a little more volume of tomatillo in there. And it all depends on how long you cook it for. It depends on how much evaporation you got when you roasted them. These recipes are designed with a lot of leeway so that they're going to be safe no matter what. So don't worry about it if you get 4 jars instead of 3. I'm one of these weird people that likes to have, if my lid has writing on it, I want it to be lined up with the writing that's on the front of the jar that says ball or cur or whatever. And so I'm actually lining things up here. I don't always do this, but it is one of those precision things that I like. And then if you put your finger on it, it doesn't turn when you put the ring on. Finger tight here. And that just means just until you start to feel it grab, so not super tight. The idea here is you want to be able to let some of that gas from inside the jar escape as it heats up. So it needs to be loose enough that it can push its way out of the jar, but not so loose that it lets water in. It's a very confusing term, finger tight. And then into my canner. The jars are hot, the water is hot, nothing was fully boiling yet. So I've got the heat going to get it up to full speed. And then this is the little bit of extra salsa that was left that I didn't have room for in the jars. And we'll just eat those on some tacos later this evening. Water is now at a full boil, and so I'm going to start my timer, 20 minutes. And then once that's done, you'll often see modern recipes telling you to turn the heat off and let it sit for 5 minutes before you remove the jars. I think it's just an extra insurance to make sure that they seal. I don't always do it, but if I'm doing other things in the kitchen, it's no big deal to turn it off and wait 5 minutes before I take the jars out. And that's what I did here. And so these are done. And then you shouldn't move your jars around a lot right after you take them out of the canner because everything's still really soft. You want to let them cool until they're cold to the touch before you move them around a lot. This is the next morning. Everything is ready and finished. And I like to pick up my jars by the lids just to ensure that I don't have some kind of a false seal there. And these are all nicely sealed. And so these will be ready for use all year. This is a great recipe, you guys, really tasty. Give it a try. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and share. I have new content coming out every week.